Why are critics and readers so drawn to Jenny Offill's fiction? Leslie Jamison will join us to talk about Offill's new novel, Weather, and what makes her work so distinctive. What does it take to survive as a first-time author? Courtney Maum will join us to talk about Before and After the Book Deal, a writer's guide to finishing, publishing, promoting, and surviving your first book. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. It's Friday, February 7th, and this is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Leslie Jamison is here in the studio. Her most recent book is Make It Scream, Make It Burn, Essays, which was reviewed in the book review last fall. But she's here now to talk about another book she reviewed this week on our cover, Jenny Offill's Weather. Leslie, thanks for being here.
It's so wonderful to be here.
So let's first talk about Jenny Offill, who she is. Parl Sagal, a staff critic for The Times, wrote a profile of Jenny Offill in this week's issue of the New York Times Magazine. But give us a sense of who this writer is.
When I think about Jenny Offill's work and why it matters and why I think it's really created this sense of excitement around so many readers, I think part of it, she writes about motherhood and marriage and things that can get lumped under that general umbrella term domesticity, but she brings them to life in these incredibly razor-sharp ways. And there shouldn't even be a but conjunction to that sentence, right? Like, why are those states of being not razor-sharp somehow? But sometimes they can get seen as soft or sentimental. And she brings both a very different form and a very different tone, I think, to how she writes about them and how she does justice to their emotional extremity.
Now I'm thinking that we have to make a challenge to ourselves not to use the word but for the rest of this podcast. But I think, there we go, that we're going to fail. So we'll put that aside. This book, Weather, is her third novel. Her first was Last Things, and then it took her 15 years to write her next book, Department of Speculation, which came out in 2014 and was one of our 10 best books of the year. And I feel like that book really brought her to a wider attention. Perhaps not bestseller list attention, but it was hugely critically acclaimed and beloved by readers. So let's just talk a little bit about that book and why it struck such a chord.
And I think it's no accident when you said it was like 15 years until the next book, which is actually sort of part of the plot of Department of Speculation, too. It's like there's a writer who's taking a long time to put out her second novel. Part of, I think, my understanding from interviews she's done of the story of that book is that it started as a much more conventionally structured novel, and it sort of took her a long time to whittle it down to its really searing form, which is a very fragmented form where you feel like you're getting these absolutely essential bursts of experience. I think her agent described it once as more like an X-ray than a body, which I thought was such an amazing evocation of how it works. And so part of why it caught hold, I think, is that it wasn't just very smart about feeling, and it had this like strong heart, and it's about infidelity and a marriage sort of repairing itself, but it also it seemed to find a new language for feeling and a new structure for feeling.
Yeah, I want to go back to that, the fragments and the structure. For people who have not read Jenny Offill, we should say this. Her books are really short. They're really, really short, but they are packed, and yet they don't feel dense. And part of that is due to structure. And you use the word fragments. People will use the word fragments or fragmentary or sort of cones. Let's talk about like how she structures these books, because it is, especially when Department of Speculation came out in 2014, it felt very different from what was being written, and it felt very different from the way in which a domestic novel was being written.
It makes me think a little bit about the way that like Virginia Woolf would describe moments of being, that somehow we have these moments where it feels like something about experience is intensified or crystallized. And I think Jenny Offill has a real knack for like putting her finger on the pulse of those moments. So maybe it's just an ordinary moment, like in this latest novel where her narrator comes home from feeling this intense panic about climate change, and her son's playing Minecraft and you sort of get like putty off of his fingers. Like, it's not in a dramatic sense, like there's not a huge plot point happening in that moment, but she manages to find these ways that seemingly insignificant moments, if you describe them so precisely and locate some kind of feeling that's happening in them, like quivering inside them, she does justice to it.
And the way that her books are structured, I don't think there are – well, I guess in this book, whether there are parts. I can't remember if in Department of Speculation she even divided into chapters, but it's these single paragraphs or a few paragraphs spaced apart on the page. So not only is it a small book, but it actually – I mean, you could theoretically sit down and read it in a couple of hours.
I did.
You did?
Yeah,
okay.
I
So
did.
not just in theory, in practice. You could sit down and read it very quickly. And one of the things that I think people then mistakenly assume is that, it's sort of hastily written. You get the sense, though, once you are reading it, that not at all. This feels something that is very much labored over, almost like poetry in terms of the precision of the ways in which the things that she's putting into those little sections, as you pointed out, it's often about the contrast in a given moment between something very granular and domestic and personal and then some larger thought that's going on or something happening in the greater world. Do you think that was what was so striking about Department of Speculation, the fact that she was doing that she was taking something like a domestic novel that was, just, as you said, kind of a story of a Brooklyn mother and infidelity and work-life balance and these things that so many books are about, but infusing in it these larger issues?
I think that's a really good point. That so often what makes these short bursts glow or feel incandescent or feel charged is that they're very granular, but they're also holding some kind of emotional intensity. And I think when you're writing about something like infidelity, where there's both the danger of somehow telling a story that people feel like they've heard before or a story that feels intrinsically melodramatic, it can really bring out the humanity of the story to pay attention to the granularity of one scene that's rising to mind from that novel is the narrator after a conflict with her husband going to stay at a hotel overnight and praying on the carpet of the hotel floor. But it's like that hotel carpeting that holds so much feeling rather than just the larger abstraction of infidelity per se or something. And so I think it is that scale shifting that can happen in the space of a paragraph, can then happen across the course of the whole book. That's also really operative in this latest book where the scales are even bigger because, among other things, it's a book about climate change, which is one of the biggest scales.
Yes. Yeah. Let's talk about weather. And let's start with what it's about, even though, as I think people are probably sensing when you talk about Jenny Ofill's work, it really isn't about plot.
Yeah.
But what is Weather about?
Yeah, so the narrator of Weather is a mother who years ago dropped out of a PhD program and is working as a university librarian, and she takes a job working for her former mentor who does a podcast about climate change where she's answering all the letters that are coming in response to this podcast. So there are a few different, there's the kind of plot of her.
I want Jenny Ofill's narrator to answer my letters to this podcast. I'm just kidding. I love answering your letters.
I would be Oh, I thought you were going to say answer my letters. I was like, I have a few letters that I would like to write Jenny Offill. Yeah, I mean, so, you have this narrator as a mother, you have her as a wife, you have her as a worker, and maybe a worker who feels a bit lost in the world. There's also, for me, one of the most compelling plot lines in the book is about the narrator's relationship with her brother, who's a recovering addict. He gets married and then has a baby, and her role in his life and her sort of desperate hope that he can kind of put his life together was a really moving strand amongst strands for me as well.
Presumably, that's very deliberate, bringing new life into a world that is in crisis and feels like it's ending.
And I think that's one of the abiding emotional tensions in the book is the world is always beginning and ending at once, and maybe there's something about that truism that has felt universal through time, but it has a particular acuity now where the world is its ending is hastened in a particular way by these factors that are at work. But that dynamic of yes, the world is ending, but also you wake up in the morning and you're touching base with your brother over text to make sure he and the baby are doing okay, that both of those are real and both of those are happening.
I think we're seeing a wave of climate fiction, and it's taking all of these different forms, probably most noticeably post-apocalyptic and dystopian, although there are also books like Richard Powers's The Overstory, sometimes metaphorical, sometimes very reality-based. This feels different, though. I mean, how does this differ from other fiction looking at climate and climate change?
For starters, you don't have the kind of like emotional buffer of the post-apocalyptic landscape. That emotional buffer might sound like a strange way to describe a post-apocalyptic landscape, but it's like if the apocalypse is happening in like a Brooklyn public school or like that's the stage set for the book, it feels more disquieting in certain ways because it's closer to home. It's not like a Cormac McCarthy novel where a father and son are like, you know, traveling the charred landscape. Like it's more immediate in that way. And I think one of the challenges of writing about climate change is how to take this thing that is essentially on a larger scale than our minds can hold and how to make it a narrative we can hold. There's this moment early on in Weather where the narrator is thinking about her son Eli's elementary school, and she says the problem with the school is that it's not built on a human scale. It feels too large for these little children who are going into it. And I think in a way that lays out one of the aesthetic challenges of the book, right, is like climate change isn't quite on a human scale, but narrative is on a human scale. So how do you translate?
How does she do it?
Part of it has to do with what we were talking about a little bit earlier, these questions of sort of scale shifting and simultaneity, where you have these big questions of like the end of the world coming up, either through the letters that are coming into this podcast or, you know, this narrator is doing what I think we all do, obsessive Googling about lots of things where she's sort of trying to see like, you know, how hot is it going to be in New York City and, you know, when her son is 60 years old or something like that and getting so freaked out by these numbers. So you sort of have those larger questions that are always coming up against the interpersonal dramas of the book. So either it's like the abstraction of like how hot is the world going to get comes up against the body of her actual son who she's imagining at age 60, or thinking about like the horsemen of the apocalypse coming in comes up against, you know, coming home and giving the dog his slobber frog toy, you know, so that it becomes on a human scale because we see a particular human with a particular life, a particular brother who's bringing new life into the world, that all of those abstract questions are hitting all of those granular particulars.
Would you say the central question is really, you know, how do you tend to your own garden while the world is burning?
There definitely feel like some references to Voltaire and Candide here, but I think ultimately it's like how do you look outward from your own garden? Maybe how do you tend your garden and not stay completely trapped in your own garden while the world is burning? And how do you love a burning world? How can you have love for the things of this world and the relationships of this world and try to hold on to the reality that it's in this deep peril?
How did this new book, Weather, compare for you with her second book, Department of Speculation?
Like so many people, I had a really kind of passionate, visceral relationship with Department of Speculation. And I think Weather didn't make me feel as intensely as Department of Speculation did, but I was utterly compelled by it. And like I said, I read it in a single sitting, felt like really awed by it on so many levels. And I think in a way, the fact that it didn't have quite the same visceral emotional impact was a kind of testimony to the ambition of what it was trying to do. To, you know, climate change in a way is harder to feel about than infidelity because it's not essentially an interpersonal drama. So it made sense to me on a certain level that this novel was hitting almost a different sense of nerve endings and maybe a slightly less super sensitized sense of nerve endings than that last one. But there were also a lot of continuities between the two books for me in terms of this very close, subtle attention to the ways that people are, you know, inhabiting many identity roles at once, feeling intense amounts of like conflict and ambivalence at once. Also this dynamic I think Jenny Offill is so good at describing where you can be really deep inside your own pain and then have some moment where something cracks open and you become suddenly aware of the pain of another person, which is such a kind of core human reality, I think, to try to evoke. And she finds really great ways of evoking it.
I wonder about readers coming to Jenny Offill's work with this novel for the first time, maybe not having read Department of Speculation. Even though there were only 6 years between the two novels, in that period, I feel like there were many Jenny Offill-esque books and kind of imitations of her style that it might strike people as less distinctive and extraordinary coming to this book. And one of the things I find about her style that feels very contemporary to me is that it's almost the perfect style for a distracted world because of the way it is fragmentary, that it does require attention, obviously, and the more attention you pay, the more you notice what she's doing. But it is extremely easily digestible.
There are interesting ways that people have spoken and written about the fragmentary form in relation to like contemporary distraction or even in relation to motherhood or this idea of like what can be written in bursts or when you only have small fragments of time. But I think I often have a slightly different response to it, which is that, as you were saying earlier, I don't think of this as, say, prose that could be written during nap time or like written during like small gaps of experience. Like it feels like part of this like pretty cohesive and intricate vision. And maybe the correlative to that in a reading experience is I find that when I read it, I actually do want to have a really immersive experience with it, even though theoretically it would be easier to read these little units like on a subway stop and then like as I'm hit the office and have 2 minutes before I have to get started. But it actually it makes me want to create the kind of reading experience that I think actually is harder to create these days.
I saw an image, I think it's in the Times Magazine profile of Jenny Offill, but I saw this online of her bulletin board, like one of her sort of working visuals that I guess must be in her home office. And it's this kind of incredible board with these little teeny strips of paper of type that she's printed out. And you really get a sense of her process and the fact that it is very deliberate. It's not, as you say, hastily typed out between, breastfeedings or anything like that.
That sounds like a remarkable image, and I'm always obsessed with seeing – it feels like you're looking inside somebody's brain, or talk about X-rays, like you're getting to see the whole internal landscape when you see their process board.
Do you have a process board?
I have like no space for – I have no idea where I would even put a process board, but –
You're making me feel better.
My toddler would probably wreck a process board as soon as it came into being. But I was thinking about one thing that you said about how – in the years between Department of Speculation and this novel, maybe there have been a lot of or more novels that are sort of working in this mode and the mode that she pioneered that's a little bit more fragmentary. I'm not thinking of particular examples here, but I think one thing that I've found to be true about the fragmentary form is that it can be deceptive. Like you feel like, oh, I could do that,
right.
But it's actually so hard to get it right. And so in a way, it's a pretty hard form to imitate because you have to figure out and trust and have a lot of confidence, I think, that precisely these strokes are going to do the work you need them to do. And when
like
they
poetry.
don't, it just feels sort of thin or anemic rather than somehow simultaneously like lean and powerful.
You were not here to talk about your last essay collection, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. You were here for the empathy exam, so listeners can go back and find that episode. What are you working on now? Are you working on another essay collection?
I have just started thinking about and working on a book of nonfiction that is actually operating right after I've said these things about the fragmentary mode being a hard mode to get right, that is operating in a bit of a fragmentary mode. And it's thinking about some of the questions in this book about simultaneity. And so it's thinking about motherhood and the first 2 years of my daughter's life and motherhood and art and motherhood and various kinds of life rupture and sort of how to hold joy and pain at once, which is a way of thinking about the beginning and the ending of the world existing in a single moment. But, in a way, it feels in conversation with books like Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights and Renata Adler's Speedboat, but also in certain ways with Jenny Offill and Maggie Nelson and some of these contemporary writers who are working with whittling, I think, in really compelling ways.
Well, I won't torture you by asking any more detailed questions about what you're working on because I know how terrible that can be, but you will hopefully be back here as a guest when that book comes out.
That would be lovely. It's great to be here today and to see you again, Pamela, as always.
Such a pleasure to have you. Leslie Jamison is the author of 4 books, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, essays, The Empathy Exam, also essays, The Gin Closet, a novel, and The Recovering, a memoir. This week in the book review, she reviews on our cover Weather, a novel by Jenny Offill. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
What's new?
So we have some good bookstore news and some bad bookstore news. What would you like to start with?
Let's start with the bad so we can end with the good.
And they're connected. So as we've talked about on the podcast before, there has been this recent and encouraging development in the retail book market where independents have been recovering largely and their numbers are growing, but it's still a really tough market for independent bookstores in Manhattan. Rents are just so high and a lot of stores have been under pressure. And as people might have heard, a beloved independent store called Book Culture, which is on the Upper West Side, went out of business this year. City marshals actually took control of it. They hadn't paid their rent in a while.
Wow, what does that mean? It's like they show up at the door and...
I guess so, yeah.
It sounds violent.
It's dramatic. No, it wasn't like an early morning raid, like an FBI-style one. But,
give us your books.
Yeah, but apparently they owed more than $100,000 in rent. They put out calls for donations and things, but it wasn't enough. So that closed, and of course, everyone was devastated. It's terrible when you lose your neighborhood independent. And then there was some exciting news related to that. So this week, the Strand announced that they are going to be opening a satellite store in the former space occupied by Book Culture. And the Strand is a legendary independent store. They're known for just their vast selection. They have new books and used books. And you can get lost in their store for hours and hours just going through the racks and seeing what they have. So the announcement came in, of course, people were delighted that, this wasn't going to be turned into another nameless retail store, but rather a bookstore that has, a ton of character and is famous for its sales staff. They're extremely knowledgeable. You have to take a pretty tough test to get to work there.
Have you ever taken that test?
No, have you?
No, but I feel like we should.
I'd be curious. I don't imagine that I would pass. But so this was a statement that went out from the Strand owner, Nancy Bass-Wyden, and she said, "We aim to continue the legacy of my father and his father before him by bringing the joy of books to everyone."
So, okay, a few questions.
Yes.
The Strand on 11th Street in Manhattan, I think it's like 11,000 square feet of books is part of their tagline.
Yes, it's vast.
How many square feet is this space?
Yeah, this is certainly not going to be as expansive as their original location. I think, according to news reports, this space is 4,000 square feet, much smaller than their central store. But they are going to be hosting a lot of events as they do downtown, and I think it's just nice for the literary community on the Upper West Side to have another outlet.
As a former Upper West Sider, I have many, many laments and questions about that neighborhood, including why can't it sustain a great bagel store? And
that is shocking.
It is shocking. And this bookstore space, used to be, I think before it was Book Culture, it was Endicott Books. There have just been a number of bookstores that have closed on the Upper West Side. It feels like it makes sense. It seems like something deserves to survive there. There are still a few stores on the Upper West Side, bookstores, but let's hope the Strand succeeds.
Yes. I think it has such a strong reputation. I could see people commuting to this store from other neighborhoods. I certainly plan to go check it out when it opens.
All right. There's another big bookstore story this week.
Yes. This week, Barnes & Noble generated some news and attention, and not necessarily in a positive way. The store announced that they had this project called Diverse Editions that they were using to raise awareness and discussion about diversity during Black History Month. But the project was seen as somewhat ill-conceived by a lot of readers who voiced their concerns on social media. The basic premise was that they were partnering with Penguin Random House and used artificial intelligence to look through 100 classic books. And if there wasn't an explicit reference to the character's race, they selected those books and they created covers for those books that featured diverse characters. This was, I think, conceived as an effort to sort of promote diversity in literature. But the biggest and loudest critique was, well, why not then just promote books by authors of color that feature characters of color instead of trying to sort of retrofit the canon? So that project was very quickly abandoned. It was supposed to start on Wednesday, February 5th with an event at Barnes & Noble, but Barnes & Noble decided to cancel it.
All right, a side note here perhaps, but I also want to say I'm very leery of using artificial intelligence to analyze these books because Moby Dick,
Romeo and Juliet, you can read it.
But also Moby Dick starts with Queequeg in the first scene, and he is definitely not white. It just seemed like a really weird thing to have a computer program determine which books didn't have characters of color in them. I just don't know. Or that just because they didn't specify that it wasn't clear given the cultural and the social and the political context of those stories.
Yes, exactly. I think that was another point of criticism. You're talking about classic literature, The Secret Garden, Romeo and Juliet, Moby Dick, and others, and why use artificial intelligence? And I think because the company responded pretty swiftly to concerns and criticism, this isn't a controversy that has legs like other recent ones that we've seen in the literary world.
One nice thing when it comes to classics, and something that Penguin Random House has been really great with, is issuing a number of books by writers of color, some of them long out of print, some of them never published, through its Penguin Classics line. And there have been a number of those this year, including just this month, Claude McKay's novel, Romance in Marseille, which was a novel of the Harlem Renaissance that took 87 years to finally come out, but was published as a Penguin classic.
That's such a fascinating story. I love stories like that where there's some kind of ignored or overlooked long dead project that suddenly people read in a new light and it gets its day. It's a shame that it took so long, but it's great that it's out now.
Well, let's hope many readers discover that book and others like it. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks, Pamela.
Courtney Maum joins us now. Her new book is called Before and After the Book Deal, A Writer's Guide to Finishing, Publishing, Promoting, and Surviving Your First Book. Courtney, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled.
This is not your first book. It's your fourth book. What inspired you to write this book?
I think it started when my first book came out, a novel called I'm Having So Much Fun Here Without You.
A great title.
Thank you. I had to fight for that because it's pretty long. But I looked around me and I realized that, we're in a culture where there's a lot of books and MFA programs and summer conferences that teach you how to write and learn to revise well enough to get a book deal. But the minute you realize your dream and you actually do get a book deal, there's nothing. There's not a lot of resources. There's certainly no books about it. And the conversations that you do have are a little loaded and icky. You can't really complain. It's hard to voice your fears. So I wanted to put something out there for people who are navigating this immense privilege that nevertheless leaves you pretty raw and vulnerable.
What was the scariest thing for you after you wrote your first book? You've written 3 novels, so after that first book.
I think the scariest thing for me was that my ego got in my way. My first book was an unexpected success, so my agent said, let's try to sell the second. I came up with an idea pretty quickly, and I simply didn't give myself enough time. I have been... I would say I identify as a writer all my life. I'm pretty quick. I work as a copywriter. I meet deadlines. So I gave myself only a year to get that book in. And for me, I felt like I was on the top of the world. I had a really supportive editor, lots of great reviews, but that did not leave me enough time to falter, to do the writing process, to write the first draft for myself, mess up, revise. A year only allows you to knock it out of the park and get it right. And I'm a very type A Virgo. I missed my deadline. This was like a really big deal for me. So I think the hardest thing was realizing even if your book does well or it doesn't matter. You're supposed to write another one.
Right. I think that is very hard. People think, I got the book deal, so I'm done, and don't realize that most books, there are exceptions, and it's very exciting for those people, but most books sort of don't sustain you for the rest of your life.
They absolutely don't sustain you. And, also the people who get, I'm not talking about the $1 million book deals, but, solid book deals, I'm $100,000, $120,000. Those payments usually come in 4 times over 2 years. And if the book doesn't perform well, that's it. There are wonderful things that can happen. It can be optioned or translations can sell. But, you are entering a system where you're supposed to keep putting product out. And that transition from it being a sort of secret art, a passion to an actual profession is another reason I wanted to write this book, because it doesn't get talked about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, even that advanced notion, I feel like people outside the book world, and even to extent first-time authors, you hear something like six-figure advance. They don't realize then when you break down even a very nice six-figure advance, let's say a $500,000 advance, you're going to break it down, as you said, into 3 or 4 payments. Now the tradition is 4, with part of it coming on signing. So let's say it's over a 3-year period. Let's say you write your book in a year, which again, as you point out, it's a pretty quick turnaround. You get in a $500,000 advance, let's say it's even 2 payments, and that's not going to happen because usually, right, it's like you deliver 100 pages, you get a quarter, you turn in your full manuscript, you get another quarter. On publication, you get that third quarter, and then now
paperback
often you get the fourth quarter. So okay, let's divide it into $125,000 over the course of 3 years. Not a lot of money when you consider that you pay your taxes, so that takes out almost half of it. You're paying the agent 15%. Yeah. And so what you
maybe you have dependents, and I mean, everyone's life is very difficult. For some people, like out where I live, that would go very far, that amount of money. If you're living in Manhattan, you have 3 kids, maybe not so much. But something else I wanted to talk about in this book are the people that get $5,000 book deals.
Right.
People who get a box of books and a beer as a book deal. And I'm not making fun. This with micro presses, that's what you're looking at, $500 a box of books. And I really wanted to speak to the Tony Doors, the Roxane Gays, and also the people who are publishing with these micropresses to get a look at the type of writer lives that we don't read about in the profiles. We don't hear how these people are actually making ends meet, and why they're writing. You know, they have to. That's some burning desire in them. But how are they making a living? And I wanted to examine in this book ways to use your writing skills outside of the realm of academia as well, and to recognize you have skills, and you're not getting those big advances. Most people won't, but there's still a path for you.
Right. You divide the book into before the book deal and after the book deal. Let's talk about before. What would you say are most aspiring writers' sort of biggest misperceptions, and what information did you sort of most want to arm people with?
This is on my mind a lot because I'm starting to work privately with writers. And what I'm finding, we're in this culture where everything has to be branded and sort of social media ready. So a major mistake I'm finding with emerging writers is that they're thinking about the way their work is going to be received in the marketplace and marketed well before they even have a solid draft. Mm-hmm. And people are getting in their way. You don't even have the privilege of asking yourself how you're going to be marketed until you get the writing right. People are fast forwarding to the end game and not learning how to revise, especially now that you can pay a lot of people to help with your manuscripts, right? This can be an exceptional tool. But if you don't learn how to revise yourself and protect yourself against your less flattering habits, it's going to be a really, really hard industry to make it buy in, because if you do have any level of success, you get thrown these assignments all the time. Write an off-the-book piece, write an op-ed. Oh, could you do a blog post? And you have to learn how to generate quality content quickly.
You have to know how to write.
You have to learn how to write. So people are kind of, either they're skipping over that, or I don't know, they're going, I can't really speak to this. I don't have an MFA, but I do think at the MFA level, perhaps you're learning to write a certain way, or, you're exposed to certain books. All of that's fine, but you need to learn how to write. You really do. That's so important. It's the most important thing. It's what's going to get you a book deal. You can have a trendy topic, but unless you're a celebrity, the writing has to be great. The story has to be great.
What's the most common question that you get asked about people before they sign their deal?
I think definitely the most common question remains, how do I get an agent? And this comes back to what I've said before. The way you get an agent is to, not send off your first draft that you feel really good about, but to send off the 11th, Mm-hmm. And we get so much rejection in our lives as writers that normally people accept their very first offer from an agent. They're thrilled that finally someone said yes, right? But at the end of the day, literary agents are the employee of writers. They take 15% of more or less everything that we make. They need to be our business partners. They need to be our creative partners. To a certain degree, we hope that they're our friends. But, it's not enough that an agent just likes what you do. I think that they have to have a a view of the arc of your career, not just this book, what's the next book going to be, what's the third book going to be. And probably at this point in the game, you might want someone that works with you as a developmental editor, because acquiring editors, especially at the large houses, they have no time. They're in meetings all the time. So again, it's not as easy as you finally get an agent and then you're off to the races.
Do you think that in general that idea from agent, editor to the publishing house of, the bigger, the more prestigious, the better is a misperception that authors have? That it's not necessarily about getting the big name agent or the major publisher if the editor isn't the right person, or if you're not going to necessarily get personalized attention from that agent?
I think a misperception that a lot of people have is that everything depends on the debut. I do think in America we are outsizedly obsessed with the debut, especially if it's a young, attractive person. Ultimately, the end game should probably be that our first book does well enough that we have the privilege to publish again. I think that's a more sustainable viewpoint. And listen, hey, I hope it for everyone. But if your very first book is an insane success, well, you're not going to have a lot of time to write, Sometimes, I'm not going to say it's a curse. Of course it's not a curse. To make money in this industry is a real privilege. But you'll be left with very little time for yourself and for that private, quiet voice inside of you that just wants to sit down and write. And if you're away from that too long, for some people, it can be hard to go back to. And if you have the expectations, you've hit the bestseller list with your first book, well, gosh, where do you go after there? What if you want to pivot? God forbid you want to try another genre.
Right, especially when there's that idea of that brand.
Absolutely. A lot of editors and publishing houses, they'll tell you, well, your readers, they won't follow you there. You have to change your name. You have to use a pen name. You can't go write a thriller if you've done a rom-com.
All right, I want to talk about the second half of your book title, which is the after the book deal, because most people outside of publishing and first-time authors think, I've got a book deal. I'm done.
Right, that's it. You're done.
We're done.
You're not done.
I'm all set.
That's when it starts.
Yes. Really. How do you break down the process after that?
Therapy. I'm serious. I am not making light. You need someone to talk to because, unfortunately, and I think this has been revealed in the past weeks, publishing's not great with the communication. There's problems there. And the agent is usually the go-between, which makes everything kind of awkward. It's hard for writers to talk to their publicists. Everyone's trying to do their best job, so there's some defensiveness there, which I understand. But I do think that the publishing industry could do better to realize that they are publishing the work of yearning, striving human beings who are feeling very raw. And so it's about measuring and understanding also the extent to which you feel comfortable being your own PR agency. There's a lot of pressure on authors right now to be their own social media managers, to be performing themselves. And this is for people who have spent, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, all alone in some funky room.
Not the best performers
in disgusting pajamas, talking to voices in their heads, and then they're thrown out on the road, supposed to do all sorts of very public-facing things. Even if you're good at it, it takes energy away from our private, creative selves, and learning how visible and how public you can be versus, I feel something inside myself. I need to stop. I need to get offline. You have to have a fulcrum inside of you. If you don't, I promise you, you are going to spend all of your time online refreshing, just hoping that, some email is going to come in that Oprah's chosen you for the book club, and these things don't come in. So really, you'd be best served by moving on to the next project. I think that that's important to set that time aside.
You could have a little chapter like Oprah's not emailing you anytime
It's
soon.
in there. There is actually a line that says that email, first of all, you can go to an island where there's no way to reach you and someone will reach you you don't need to be online to find out that that's happening.
Right. If Oprah wants to get you, she'll find a way to get in touch.
Yeah.
The other thing I think, again, that is surprising to people outside this industry is that when you sign your book deal, it's a very different thing if you're fiction or nonfiction. Because if you're fiction, you've written your book most of the time.
Usually, certainly for the first book, that's right. And then with nonfiction, a lot of people can sell a book on just a proposal. And I certainly have interviews in this book. I have interviews with about 175 different writers and publishing professionals. And a lot of the nonfiction writers said that they were very surprised to realize that they had to write an entire book once the proposal was accepted. And certain writers said, you know what? It's just the kind of mind I have. It took me longer to write the proposal than I think it would have taken if I'd written the book itself.
What's the biggest thing? This is a two-part question. What's the biggest thing people worry about once they've signed their book deal, and maybe what should they be worried about that they don't necessarily think of?
The thing is that they worry about sales. Will the book sell? But nobody sits us down and helps us writers understand what's expected of us. How many books should we sell? We have no idea. If you know that you're a lead title, well, you know that you have support behind you. But what does that mean? Like, literally, no one knows. If people are walking around, and even the people with the $1,000 book deals, they're like, maybe there's some amazing world in which I'll get the New York Times bestseller list, but they don't actually know the colossal amount of copies. I think they think it's like, oh, maybe if I sell, 300 copies in a week or something. They don't know that it's 90,000 or, it's whatever. So I tell people, you're obviously going to have a lot of anxiety if you don't even know how long the marathon is that you're running.
Yes.
So find out, don't ask how many copies, because who at this time, like especially fiction, it's not selling super great. So the number's going to be more modest than you think. Why don't you find out what your initial print run is going to be? Maybe it's a modest number, 2,000, 3,000. Then ask for support from your publisher. How do you think I can sell through that first print run? I think that that's a really manageable way for people to feel more in charge of their sales and, sales-related success than to just shoot around and trying to sell 30,000 copies in a week, which is going to be hard even for household names, honestly, at this point.
I think for many of our listeners, some of these phrases, that we're using, they don't even necessarily know what they mean. So let's just go back. And what do we mean by a lead title? What is that?
Okay, so a lead title, regardless of the size of a publishing house, whether it's what we consider the big five, which are corporate publishing houses, or smaller presses, independent presses like Catapult, which this book is published with, there'll be certain titles either per month or one for the entire year that the house is going to put their full support behind in terms of resources, energy, and money. In many cases, that means, especially at the larger houses, that they will tour the author, that they will pay for the tour, that they'll set aside a marketing budget. Whereas with titles that they're not sure they're taking a risk on and they're not sure are going to perform well, you won't see that author being toured. They'll do some social media coverage. Of course, they'll hopefully try to get a little publicity, but that's not their lead horse,
The other thing that you mentioned is an advance. And I think this, again, is confusing to people, the way in which authors make money. Explain what, we talked about how an advance is this money you get, ahead of time that is paid out according to a schedule, usually 4 payments now. How does that work against copies that you sell and royalties? How do writers get rich, for example? Or how do they make even a living if they have a small advance? How does that all work?
Okay, so another mistake I think people go into in this industry is thinking that they'll make any money at all, that they can live off of. I firmly believe that you should have another stream of income until you don't need to. That's one thing. The writers who are doing really well, number one, out the gate, their publishers believe in the book. Like I said, they have a lead title. They're probably pretty good at social media. They already have a platform. And then things happen. They get speaking engagements. Those can be very lucrative. When your book sells in foreign territories, sometimes certain territories like Germany, for a buzzy title, they might pay as much as $40,000. Sometimes they pay a lot. Listen, for most people, they're not paying a lot, $500, $1,000. Options for film, television, and sort of audio originals are away right now. But most people, and this is very important to me that we remember that there's so many writers out there who are not making a living off of their writing, and they're writing anyway. I have been that person. I will be that person again, and I love those people. And most of them are teaching. But they're adjuncting.
So given that you've been paid in advance beforehand and you get that paid out, what does it mean to get royalties? And when do you get royalties? How does that work?
So a lot of people never see royalties. It depends on your advance. If you get a colossal advance, like $1 million, what have you, they're not necessarily expecting that you're going to earn back your advance. Most writers only earn back maybe 70% of their, not even most writers, most big deal writers are earning back 70%. A lot of publishers at the Big Five level, they're consciously overpaying either because they really want to acquire a certain author, a certain project at a certain time. They know they're paying too much. If we go down into the smaller leagues, let's say you got a $50,000 advance, more or less, I mean, there's all sorts of factors, but more or less, you need to sell through the equivalent of what $50,000 worth of copies would be. And that can be all mixed together. If you have an audiobook, you have a hardcover or, paperback. And once you earn back that advance.
It's calling earning out.
Earning out, exactly. Then you start to see the royalty payments. Sometimes if you have a happy surprise, you can earn out your book before the book even comes out because there's more pre-orders than they expected, or maybe you get a big foreign sale or the audiobook sale goes for a lot. There can be really happy surprises when you're getting a smaller advance.
This book, as I mentioned earlier, is divided into sections with many, many subsections, from the book party to the book tour to handling your inbox to blurbing in academia and do I need to go to parties and all of this great stuff. And it's very fun to read, even if you've been through this, or maybe especially if you've been through this. But I think my favorite section heading is called "You Drive Me Crazy." The things authors do that drive publishing professionals nuts. And so I'd be remiss if, as our last question, if I didn't ask about this. What drives publishers insane?
I think it's when authors forget that they have other authors. That they have other clients, that their agent has other clients, that their book is the only thing that matters in the universe. Now, on the flip side, that's what it feels like when you're the writer, but sometimes it's hard for people to imagine what an editor's inbox actually looks like, what a publicist's inbox actually looks like, and that all of our publishing friends can't be all things to us authors. A lot of people expect their agent to be their therapist and their publicist to be their personal assistant, and these are people not getting giant salaries, doing their best. In most cases, they're doing their best. And we want them to respect our time. We need to respect theirs. So that section, I did want the publishing professionals to weigh in and say, listen, if you're not getting a good response from your team, the problem might be you. There's some obnoxious authors out there, and I have what I think are pretty funny anecdotes about authors behaving badly.
All right, I want to end with an anecdote, but before I do, I just want to insert one figure here for people to bear in mind, since we're talking about the low-paying nature of this field, which is that even at one of the Big Five publishers, the entry level for an editorial assistant, average salary at a Big Five publisher is $35,000. That is in New York City.
In New York City, that's
where
important.
That monthly take home is not enough to pay rent in all likelihood. So just to factor it in, and those are the people that you're driving crazy some of the time.
But so send them some wine if they drink from time to time. Honestly, don't forget the editorial assistants. People always forget them.
So let's end with a really funny story.
Oh, mine?
Yeah. Anyone. It could be a personal one or it could be one from your book.
So, one of the things that sparked me to write this book was the very first day, my pub day for my very first book. I'd gotten such amazing press that I drove to a town where I knew no one, thinking oh my God, am I going to find a parking spot? Is there going to be a line out the door? How cool would that be?
Courtney Maum is coming to town.
She's coming to town. And then as I got closer to the store, I realized this book literally came out this morning. Even my closest friends they haven't had time to read it. I'm not a known name. Who the heck's going to be at this event in this town where I don't know anyone? Well, 3 people. One was the Simon & Schuster sales agent, one was the bookstore owner, and one was an elderly gentleman who was asleep in the front row. Oh, no. And that was the kickoff to my nationwide book tour, which led me to wonder perhaps the facade that we see on social media of the glamorous author life is not actually what is great.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Literary Success. All right, Courtney, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Courtney Maum is a novelist and also the author of a new guidebook, Before and After the Book Deal, a writer's guide to finishing, publishing, promoting, and surviving your first book. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, Dave Kim, and Tina Jordan. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi. Tina, let's start with you.
So I'm reading a novel called The House of Trelawney by Hannah Rothschild. And this was recommended to me by Elida Becker, Long
dearly
time book
departed.
review, dearly departed Elida
She's
Becker.
still alive.
She is the longtime book review editor who's just retired, and she and I share a lot of the same taste in fiction. And this is a big, juicy, dysfunctional family saga set at an 800-year-old castle in Cornwall. I'm going to read you a short description of it. It has 4 miles of corridors. That's an astonishing thing. The beauty of the interiors paled next to its setting. To the north of the castle were 400 acres of medieval oak woods set in deep cushions of moss laced with streams chasing over granite boulders. Different times of the year, the glades were carpeted with flowers, crocuses, snowdrops, bluebells, wild garlic, rare orchids. I mean, you can just imagine. So the Earl and his wife are still alive. The Earl-to-be, who's I think in his 40s or 50s, is losing his fortune in London. The castle is falling apart. He does have a sister from whom he's estranged who runs a very successful hedge fund and has money and who clearly is going to become involved. I'm not at that point yet. It's just at the point where everything is being set up for disaster, which is just how I like it.
That's actually where I am in my book, too.
Oh, what are you?
I'll jump right in.
Yeah.
I'm reading Bad Blood nonfiction by John Carreyrou. That's Carreyrou. He spent 20 years as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where he broke the story of Theranos, which was the Silicon Valley startup trying to revolutionize blood testing, making it so that patients could just keep a machine in their house and prick their own fingers and do very elaborate blood tests, sort of the way diabetics do already for glucose testing, except that Theranos was going to do it for a lot more than just glucose. You could, test for various proteins and see how drugs were affecting their diseases, catch diseases very early in the game. It's a very ambitious startup run by a very young Stanford dropout. In fact, she dropped out of Stanford early in her sophomore year in order to start this company. Very smart, talented, ambitious, charismatic, and ruthless and reckless, named Elizabeth Holmes, who, in pursuit of this goal, was touted as and saw herself as kind of the next Steve Jobs, only in biotech. And she drove her employees really hard, kind of into the ground. There was tremendous turnover at this company. And as much as her idea had promise and maybe, was feasible, she just at every step of the way got out too early. Mm-hmm. She raised money too early. She went on sales calls too early when nothing was quite working yet. And so everything is just set up for a disaster. It's clear that she's over-touting the revenues and the potential for revenues. And anytime that anybody raises this stuff as you need to slow down, there's a red flag, she just cans them or forces them off the board. Or, it's you're at this feeling where you think this could really have been something. It's not like she set out to be a con artist. She set out really with real visions and just mismanaged everything so badly and wouldn't take advice and wouldn't listen to anybody, and it ended up being a huge disaster. I know that the second part of this book will be Carreyrou talking about it as a journalist, how he came across the story and uncovered it, and how Theranos tried to stop him from reporting on it. I'm not there yet. I'm still at the everything is going wrong phase.
Okay, I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
One, is it true that she didn't start out as a total con artist? Because for some reason I got the impression, sort of reading, about it, that this was sort of a real bad player from very early on.
It's hard to separate her ambition and her mismanagement. I think it is true that she thought this technology was possible. She had this vision for it. She recognized the market for it. And again, she just rushed. I may learn more from the book, or you may need to ask Carreyrou himself. But I believe that she thought she could make this happen. Mm-hmm. She was not just out to con people. And it was as things started falling apart, she just tried to hide that and paper over it all. And it became kind of a con game, but it didn't start out as like a sales pyramid type scheme.
Okay, and the other question I have is just as a potential reader, because I have a copy of this book and everybody loves it and everyone was reading it and I think it's newly out in paperback. And so it's on my shelf. And when I thought about, potentially picking it up, I had that feeling of like, oh, but is this all over now? And it is over, right? But
yeah, the story of Theranos is over, except in court. I think that, yeah, she's still facing charges, and we'll need to see what happens legally. And there's an afterword to this book that will go into some of that. But just as a read, so forget reading it as journalism then, if your point is, well, the story's already happened. It's a really riveting read. It's vivid, it's fast-paced, and it's one of these stories because it brings together science and technology and Silicon Valley. It's a story of a startup. It's entrepreneurialism. So it feels like it speaks to a lot of larger things going on in the culture. And again, you feel like her vision for the company, her original vision for the company, if somebody is more careful and spends the time to get it right, we're maybe not that far away from these microfluid blood tests that she envisioned. There are some technical issues to be resolved, but it feels very relevant still, even though Theranos itself has blown up already. And Carrie Rue just also has a really great eye for the journalistic detail. Like, before it was called Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes called the company Real Time Cures. But because of a typo, a lot of the early paychecks went out as Real Time Curses. And later on, she gave an interview to a Silicon Valley newsletter, a newspaper, that touted them as kind of the hottest startup in Silicon Valley. And the name of that newsletter was Red Herring. He's a great storyteller. Dave, what are you reading?
So I've got 2 books to talk about because I'm greedy. But the first is The Black Cathedral by Marcial Gala, and really wonderfully translated by Anna Kushner from the Spanish. Gala is a Cuban novelist, a poet, an architect, and he's never been translated before into English, and this is a great way to start. This novel has, multiple characters, multiple narrators, multiple storylines. It's set mostly in the southern Cuban city of Cienfuegos. I'll just talk about the 2 main narrative threads. So one is we follow the Stewarts, and this is a super religious family. The father is a very religious pastor who's trying to build this huge cathedral in Cienfuegos, trying to turn the city into a kind of Cuban Jerusalem. But of course, his children are very troubled. His 2 sons kind of get sucked into the hard knock life around them. His daughter is an artist who's, making her way out and doesn't want anything to do with the city. And then we follow a hustler named Gringo who's in love with this daughter, and partly because of thwarted love and partly because of, just crippling poverty, he becomes this murderous criminal. And just summing this book up, I think kind of makes it sound over the top. There are ghosts in it. There's cannibalism, just an unflinching look at violence. It's, there are characters named Nacho Fat Lips and Guts. But Gala really pulls it off. His voice is just really a pleasure to read. The translation really feels like it was written this way and not, and not translated. Readers of Junot Diaz are going to like this book. They recognize that, brilliantly profane, very funny voice.
As soon as you said Nacho Fat Lips, I thought of him.
Exactly. But I think there are also these nice aphoristic moments that let you know you're in the hands of a writer who's wise and knows a lot about humanity and has some great astute observations to make about it. It's just that exuberant energy, but contained in a book that's really about human weaknesses and hubris and vulnerabilities that made me like this so much.
Your other book's also a little bit about human weakness.
Exactly, which I'm frantically reading as all hell is about to break loose. The next book is The Birth Partner by Penny Simkin with Katie Ross, and I am rereading this. My partner and I are expecting our second child pretty much any minute, so I may have
dash out.
Dash out.
Studio.
Yeah, cover the birth live on the podcast, New York Times podcast. The Birth Partner was written in 1989. Now it's in its 5th edition, and it's basically a 400-page user manual for dads, partners, doulas, and other labor companions for the frantic hours and sometimes days of labor and delivery. This book really filled a void for me when I was looking for books about books for expecting dads, because the market is just really – it just appeals to the worst male stereotypes. I think everything has the word dude in the title.
Oh, that's a recent development, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't looking at the dad books.
There's books like Dude, You're Going to Have a Baby, and Diaper Dude. And I think there's one that's actually called The Reluctant Father. I just was looking for a nicely written textbook, basically, that tells you what's going to happen and what you need to do. And this book really does it. It's very comprehensive. It's sort of like, and that's almost like it's also its flaw. I mean, it really covers all the bases of, every possible scenario. It's like how to make an omelet 17 different ways. It's like, here's during a hurricane, here's what happens when your partner is punching you in the face and saying, why did you do this to me? But I think the best parts are the stories she tells of other couples and just these anecdotes that let you know, the weird rituals that people come up with during this very stressful time. One woman really needed to have her back scratched in a particular way. Another couple was really into hairbrushing during the labor. Another woman was fixated on the hole in her husband's shirt, and it became this kind of Dumbo feather. And, when he turned away, it totally ruined everything. So I really like those.
Is there a lot about
moments.
ice chips in there? I just remember ice chips.
There's a good amount about ice chips, and I may be confusing that with my labor class that I took years ago.
It sounds like you're reading the right book before your second baby's birth, but I remember before my thirds, I read the wrong book for me, which was Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, which I read in part because I was researching stories that I was reporting at the time about birth and birth choice and the growing rate of cesarean sections. And Ina May's Guide to Childbirth is the most sort of, what's the word?
Artisanal?
It's artisanal. Yeah. It's for people who give birth in a field with that's surrounded by, spiritual attendants. And I was in a hospital, extremely heavily, drugged out with an epidural. But I had read that book right before. And so I had this vision of that I was just going to wait until the baby was ready. And the doctor was like, it's really time to start pushing. And I was like, nope. The baby will send me a signal. And finally, after hours of my delaying, he was like, you actually can't feel anything. You were on so many drugs. That baby really is ready. And so sometimes you have to ignore the books, I guess.
There was nothing in the book that I put to use during our first child, which, he was almost born in the cab ride over to the hospital. And we basically just had to go up. And I'm taking the birth ball out and the yoga mat. And the nurses are like, you need to get in the hospital now. This baby's coming out in minutes. And so none of, I'm hoping this time we can
do some birth ball.
Yeah, back scratching, slow dancing.
As if. Pamela, what are you reading?
Well, like Dave, I'm going to talk about two books, and these are both books that I read. Again, I have to confess, I'm still talking about the books I read during my now very long ago vacation, but I just want to catch up with all of them. So two really different books. One was a YA novel by the writer Melissa Albert, whose first book I raved about on a podcast. It was called The Night Country, and it was a fantasy novel that was published by Flatiron, which doesn't publish a lot of children's books or YA, and it kind of felt that way in that it was not a typical YA book where everything that a character does that's bad, that you wouldn't want your teenager doing, like drinking or smoking or whatever, wasn't instantly condemned in some sort of plot, twist, or, it wasn't sort of shown to be by the way, teenage reader, you should not do this, which made it feel kind of revolutionary. And it was just a really great fantasy novel about a girl whose grandmother was a famous reclusive writer whose book disappeared, and the book was called, I think, Tales from the Hinterland. And in short order, it turns out that this hinterland, of course, actually exists. And the granddaughter, the protagonist in the book, ends up going to the hinterland. So it starts off in New York City, and then you travel to this other world, and many things happen there. And it was just really well done and felt original and had fairy tales at its basis. And then the second book that I read while I was away is called The Night Country, which came out last fall. And as with so many, second books, and I think it's probably going to be a trilogy, it's a little bit of a letdown. It felt like once she had gotten through that initial setup, she wasn't sure quite where to go. And in this world, something happens that I think often happens in those fantasy worlds or in science fiction movies, like, in Alien, they go to the planet and then the aliens come to you, that kind of thing. And the next, so this was the creatures from the hinterland sort of coming to New York City, which I guess is, kind of the next obvious step. But it just didn't come together in quite the same way. So I am holding out hopes. I think Albert.
Do you think that's a problem just with a middle book of a trilogy in general? It's such an in-between?
Often. And I think that's often, I don't know about you all, but I don't often get to the end of trilogies. Do you?
I don't either.
Like one of a trilogy that I really loved, Justin Cronin's trilogy, which started with The Passage, and I did read the 12. I still haven't read the third one. And that was another problem with this book, which is that it's very hard for me to go back to the Cronin now because it's been, I think, probably 5 years since I read the second one. I have no idea what happened in it.
Previously in Justin Cronin.
Exactly, I do. And I should have done the same thing with The Night Country. I went to this island. I didn't bring a copy of the Hazelwood with me, so I felt like I spent a good portion of the book being like, wait, what happened? Like, who is this person? So I was reading at a disadvantage. And the other book that I read while I was away is Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, which, of course, is a really excellent title. The subtitle is Resisting the Attention Economy, which also I feel is very good, and I am on board. And it's an interesting book. She was a guest on the podcast when this book came out last spring, and one of the interesting things that happened at the end of the year is that it made President Barack Obama's list of favorite books of the year, and that catapulted it onto the bestseller list.
Months after it had come out.
Right, for the first time. So the book came out in April, but it didn't make our list until December. And that happens very rarely now, for something to surface on the list so long after publication. There's so much quick turn on the bestseller list for a whole number of reasons. And that was just such a happy thing, too, because it's from a small publisher, Melville House. And Jenny Odell is a really great writer, but she's not primarily a writer. She's a visual artist, and she just has a very interesting mind. And there's a lot to think about in this book. It's a little bit of an odd structure. She does a few different things in the book, and it's not a how-to book by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing I will say is when she came on the podcast, regular listeners might remember this, mostly what we talked about was what I was really fascinated with at the time, which was her residency that she had done at a garbage dump in the Bay Area, which is like there is an artist and writer's residency. And I just was like, what did you do there? It was interesting to me how she approached that project, and I left thinking like, maybe I should have a residency at a garbage dump. That sounds kind of interesting. I don't know if I could handle the smell. And so there's a lot in here, but she tells a story that I'd actually read about before but had forgotten about, and I want to retell it because it's such an interesting one. There was this situation where there was this worker in an office in 2008 at the accounting firm Deloitte. There was a new person on staff, and everyone in the office was kind of troubled by it. And so Jenny Odell, starts off with a memo written at the time. It was like, subject, marketing trainee, importance high. And the memo starts, as I already mentioned to Z, there has been a person sitting in the tax library space and staring out of the window with a glazed look in her eyes. Female, very short hair. She said when asked that she's a trainee in marketing. She sat in front of an empty desk from 10:30 a.m., went for lunch, ... So Jenny Odell goes on to say, in the midst of a bustling work environment, she didn't seem to be doing anything except sitting at an empty desk and staring into space. Whenever someone asked what she was doing, she would reply that she was doing thought work or working on her thesis. Then there was the day she spent riding the elevators up and down repeatedly. When a coworker saw this and asked if she was thinking again, she replied, it helps me to see things from a different perspective. The employees became uneasy. Urgent inter-office emails were sent. So it turns out that this was a Finnish artist who was working on an art project. So it was like this real life kind of Bartleby situation. And this is part of a chapter called Anatomy of a Refusal. And Odell takes it to this, interesting place where, she just, in talking about attention, talking about like the way in which we pay attention to things is not just about what we attend to, but also what we sort of shut out and what we refuse to let into our consciousness. So it's definitely good to read while on vacation on a desert island, but I think also probably a really interesting thing to read like if you're working in a bustling work office on a daily basis. So I would recommend Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing. Let's run down the list of what we read again, starting with you, Tina.
Well, I've just started The House of Trelawney by Hannah Rothschild.
I'm reading Bad Blood by John Carreyrou.
I'm reading The Black Cathedral by Marcial Gala and The Birth Partner by Penny Simkin.
And I read How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell and The Night Country by Melissa Albert. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.